The heat in the Gulf of Mexico does not just sit on you, it penetrates. It works its way through the fibers of your coveralls, through the leather of your steel-toed boots, and settles deep into your marrow like a low-grade fever. It was 2 in the afternoon, and the air on the lower pipe deck of the Peregrine semi-submersible platform was thick enough to chew. It tasted of brine, diesel exhaust, and the sulfurous chemical tang of drilling mud. I wiped a smear of grease across my forehead, which only succeeded in mixing it with the sweat stinging my eyes. My name is Elias Thorne, and for the last 6 years, I've been the lead mechanical maintenance technician on this floating city of steel and rust. My world was focused entirely on a 3-inch hydraulic coupling on the No. 4 mud pump. The pump was a massive piece of machinery, a thundering heart of cast iron painted a safety yellow that had long since faded beneath layers of grime. It was vibrating, a rhythmic, deep-seated tremor that I felt in the soles of my feet rather than heard. The seals had blown 3 hours ago, spewing pressurized hydraulic fluid across the grating, and if I did not get this line reseated, the drill floor above would have to stop rotation. And nobody stopped rotation. Not at $200,000 a day. I gripped the handle of the 36-inch pipe wrench. It was heavy, a solid bar of forged steel that felt like an extension of my own arm. I adjusted the jaws around the coupling, spinning the knurled adjustment nut until the teeth bit into the metal. I leaned my weight into it. The metal groaned, a low, tortured screech of friction as the threads fought against years of salt corrosion and torque. I did not grunt. I just breathed out slow and steady, channeling my weight through my shoulder, down my arm, and into the tool. The resistance was absolute for a second, a wall of physics denying me, and then, with a sharp, vibrating snap that rang through the wrench handle and stung my palm, the coupling broke free. I spun it the rest of the way by hand, the threads gritty with dried pipe dope. The sensory details of the job were my anchor. The slick feel of the hydraulic fluid coating my gloves, the smell of ozone from the nearby electric motors, the relentless, deafening roar of the platform's operations. It was a cacophony that usually drowned out everything else. That was why I did not hear the screaming at first. I was cleaning the threads with a wire brush, the stiff bristles scraping against the steel grooves with a rhythmic rasping sound, when the general alarm initiated. It was not the prepare to abandon signal, nor was it the fire alarm. It was the frantic, uneven warble of the PA system keying up, followed by a voice that should not have been there. Usually, announcements were calm, bored, monotone directives from the control room. This was high-pitched, breathless.
Security to the galley. Medical to the galley.
Jesus, stop him! Put him down! The transmission cut with a harsh burst of static that sounded like tearing canvas. Then, silence returned, filled only by the mechanical thrum of the rig. I stood up, wiping my hands on a rag. The mud pump beside me continued its rhythmic pounding, oblivious to the human panic. I checked my radio, clipped to my chest harness. It was a Motorola heavy-duty unit, rubberized and intrinsically safe for explosive environments. Control, this is Thorne on the lower pipe deck. I copied a disturbance in the galley. Do we need a shutdown on pump 4? Dead air. I waited 5 seconds. The silence on the channel felt heavier than the humidity. Control, this is Thorne. Radio check. Nothing. Just the faint, rhythmic hiss of the open channel, a white noise that suggested the system was active, but nobody was speaking. I secured the wrench. Rule number 1 of the rig, never leave a tool where it can become a projectile. I slotted it back into the heavy canvas bag and zipped it shut. I did not run. Running on a rig is a good way to trip over a coaming, crack your skull,
and fall into the gulf. I moved with the deliberate, heavy-footed gait of a man used to walking on surfaces that were never quite stationary. I climbed the companionway ladder toward the main deck. The steel rungs were slick with condensation.
My boots clanged against the metal, a dull, hollow impact with every step. As I ascended, the noise of the machinery shifted, the deep bass of the pumps fading, replaced by the chaotic, higher-frequency sounds of the drill floor above. I emerged onto the walkway outside the accommodation block. The sun was blinding, reflecting off the whitecaps of the ocean 100 feet below. The Peregrine was massive, a labyrinth of cranes, derricks, and flare booms. But right now, it felt impossibly small. The door to the mess hall was a heavy, watertight bulkhead with a single circular window. I approached it, intending to dog it open, but stopped. Through the thick, reinforced glass, I saw chaos. The mess hall was usually a place of order, rows of stainless steel tables, the smell of fried catfish and coffee. Now it was an abattoir. Tables were overturned. Trays were scattered across the linoleum, a mess of spilled food and broken crockery. In the center of the room, a man was on top of the cook. I recognized the attacker. It was Miller, a roughneck who had just come in on the chopper this morning. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, usually quiet. Now he was moving with a frenzied, spasmodic energy, his head jerking violently as he tore at the cook's throat. It was not a fight. It was predation. I watched, frozen, my brain trying to process the mechanics of what I was seeing. The blood did not look right. It was too much, spraying in arterial pulses that painted the white walls in horrific, abstract patterns. The cook stopped struggling. Miller did not stop. He reared back, his face a mask of crimson, and looked directly at the window. His eyes were gone. Not missing, but eclipsed. The whites were flooded with dark blood, the pupils blown wide, making his eyes look like two black holes punched into a red landscape. He did not register me as a person. He registered me as biomass. He launched himself at the door. He hit the steel with a dull, meaty thud that vibrated through the bulkhead frame. He did not flinch. He did not recoil. He just clawed at the steel, his fingernails scraping against the paint with a sound like sharpening knives, leaving bloody streaks on the glass. I backed away, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. My breath hitched in my throat. This was a disease. It had to be. Rabies? Something from the shore? I turned and keyed my radio again, my voice tight. This is Thorne. Miller has gone psycho in the mess. He just killed the cook. I'm locking down the accommodation block exterior. Someone get security up here now. Still silence. I looked toward the bridge tower, the nerve center of the rig, rising 4 stories above the accommodation block. The windows were dark. No movement. Then I looked at the helideck. The Sikorsky S-92 that had brought the crew change in was still sitting there, rotors drooping. But the pilot's door was open, swinging gently in the sea breeze. A body lay on the tarmac beneath it, motionless. I was not a soldier. I was not a cop. I was a mechanic. And a mechanic knows that when a system fails catastrophically, you do not try to fix it while it's running. You isolate the core. You shut down the intakes. You save the integrity of the remaining structure. I needed to get to the engineering workshop. It was 3 decks down, in the chaotic heart of the pontoon structure. It had heavy doors, tools, and access to the rig's power grid. I started to move toward the external stairwell when the door to the infirmary,
20 feet down the walkway, burst open. The medic, a woman named Sarah, stumbled out. She was clutching her shoulder, blood seeping between her fingers. Behind her, stumbling over the combing, was the OIM, the offshore installation manager. The boss. He was not the boss anymore. His jaw hung slack, unhinged, swaying grotesquely with his movements. His skin was the color of wet ash. He moved with a stiff, jerky gait, like a puppet with tangled strings. But he was fast. Faster than a man that injured should be. "Sarah, move!" I shouted, the words tearing out of my throat. She looked up, eyes wide with shock, but her legs were failing her. She slipped on the metal grating. The OIM lunged.
He did not tackle her. He fell on her, a dead weight of hunger. I did not have a weapon. I had my tool bag. I did not think. I acted on instinct and adrenaline. I swung the heavy canvas bag by its strap. It was 20 pounds of hardened steel, wrenches, and hammers. The bag connected with the OIM's head with a sound like a wet sandbag hitting concrete. It was not a clean crack. It was a dull, heavy impact that absorbed the energy. The force knocked him sideways, rolling him off Sarah. "Get up!" I roared, grabbing her uninjured arm. She screamed as I hauled her to her feet, a raw, ragged sound of pain. But she found her footing. The OIM was already trying to rise. His head was misshapen now, the skull clearly fractured, but he did not seem to care. There was no groaning, no vocalization of pain, just a sharp, wet intake of air as he scrambled for traction on the grating. "Down!" I shoved Sarah toward the ladder well. "Go down to the pipe deck. Move!" We scrambled down the steep metal stairs. My boots rang out against the steel, a frantic clatter that echoed in the confined space of the stairwell. I could hear the OIM behind us, his body hitting the railings, tumbling more than walking, but coming relentlessly. We hit the landing of the mezzanine deck. I looked around for a weapon, a barrier, anything. There, a fire station. I grabbed the red canister of the 20-pound CO2 extinguisher. I ripped it from the bracket, the metal clip screeching in protest. It was cold and heavy in my hands. The OIM appeared at the top of the stairs. He did not pause to assess the drop. He simply threw himself down the flight. He landed in a heap of limbs at the bottom, bones snapping with dry, brittle pops that made my stomach turn. He began to stand up. His leg was bent sideways at the knee, the tibia protruding through his coveralls, white bone against blue fabric. He put weight on it, and the leg folded, but he dragged himself forward with his arms, his mouth opening and closing with that terrible, silent hunger. I stepped forward. I did not want to do this. I fixed things. I did not break them. But he was not a man anymore. He was a broken component that was threatening the system. I swung the extinguisher. I used the base of the cylinder, driving it down like a pile driver. The sound was sickening, a crunch of bone and cartilage that vibrated up through the metal canister. I hit him again, and again, until the movement stopped. Until the thing that used to be my boss was just a heap of organic matter on the steel deck. I stood there, heaving for breath, the air burning my lungs. The adrenaline was making my hands shake so violently I almost dropped the extinguisher. "Elias." Sarah's voice was a whimper. She was slumped against the bulkhead, her face gray. I dropped the extinguisher. It hit the deck with a loud, metallic ring and knelt beside her. I pulled her hand away from her shoulder. The bite was deep, ragged. It was not just a puncture. A chunk of flesh was missing. The tissue around the wound was already darkening,
turning a bruised, necrotic purple that seemed to be spreading visibly as I watched. The veins radiating from the wound were black, standing out against her pale skin like a road map of infection. She saw my face. She looked down at the wound, then back at me. She was a medic. She knew what sepsis looked like. She knew what infection rates meant. "It burns," she whispered. "It feels like fire." "We need to get you to the workshop," I said, my voice sounding hollow, like I was speaking from inside a drum. "I have a first aid kit there. Alcohol, bandages." "Elias," she said, gripping my arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her fingernails digging into my skin. "The crew change. Miller. He was coughing in the briefing room. He looked sick. It happened so fast. 10 minutes. From the first bite to that." She nodded toward the mess hall above us. 10 minutes. I looked at the black veins on her shoulder. They had already crept an inch further toward her neck. "I can't not go with you," she said. Her eyes were filling with tears, but her voice was steadying. The professional detachment was kicking in, warring with the panic.
If I turn, down there, in the dark, I'm not leaving you here. You have to." She pushed herself up, wincing. "Lock the doors. Isolate the engineering deck. If this is what I think it is, the whole rig is compromised. The stairwells are choke points. You can hold them. Sarah, go!" She screamed it, and her voice cracked, turning into a wet cough. She covered her mouth, and when she pulled her hand away, it was speckled with black blood. She stared at her palm, horrified. Then she looked at me with a terrifying clarity. "Go. Now. Before I cannot let you." I hesitated. 1,000 moral imperatives fought against the cold logic of survival. But the logic won. It always wins when the alternative is death. I grabbed my tool bag. "I'm sorry," I whispered. I turned and ran. I did not look back. I ran along the mezzanine walkway, dodging pipes and valves. I could hear other sounds now, screams drifting down from the upper decks, the crash of heavy objects, the thud of running feet. The infection was spreading down the vertical columns of the rig like oil dripping through a grate. I reached the heavy, watertight door of the secondary engineering workshop. This was my domain. It was a reinforced steel box welded to the underside of the main deck, accessible only by a single catwalk and a heavy freight elevator which I could disable. I threw myself inside. The air here was cool, smelling of machine oil and ozone. I grabbed the heavy steel wheel of the door dogs. I spun it. The mechanism engaged with a series of mechanical clunks, the steel bolts sliding into their frames. I grabbed the cheater bar, a length of pipe I kept by the door for leverage, and jammed it into the wheel, torquing it down until the rubber seal was compressed so tight it was practically fused. I was locked in. I backed away from the door, sliding down the adjacent wall until I hit the floor. I sat there in the dim light of the emergency strips, listening. For a long time, there was only the hum of the rig, the vibration of the generators, the life support of the machine continuing even as the crew died. Then, I heard it. Footsteps on the catwalk outside. Heavy, dragging steps. Then a body colliding with the door. Thud. A pause. Thud. It was a slow, rhythmic pounding, not a knock, an impact. Something throwing itself against the steel over and over again with the mindless persistence of the tide. I stood up, my legs trembling.
I needed to secure the perimeter. One door was not enough. I needed to weld. I needed to disable the elevator. I needed to inventory my air filtration. I walked over to the workbench. My hands were stained with grease and the OIM's blood. I picked up a rag and started to wipe them, scouring the skin until it was raw and red. I looked at the row of tools hanging on the pegboard.
Wrenches, hammers, screwdrivers, saws. They were clean, organized, logical. The world outside that door had lost its logic. Physics had broken down. Biology had gone wrong. But in here, in this 20 by 40-foot steel box, the rules still applied. A bolt turned clockwise to tighten. A circuit needed a closed loop to function. Steel was harder than flesh. I picked up a welder's mask and a portable oxyacetylene torch. I checked the pressure gauges. The needle on the oxygen tank rose steadily, stopping at 2,000 psi. A good, clean number. I adjusted the valve on the acetylene. I struck the flint striker. Spark. The torch flared to life with a sharp, hissing roar, a tongue of blue flame that cut through the gloom. It was a dangerous sound, a loud sound. But it was my sound. I walked to the door. The pounding on the other side was still there. Thud. Thud. I lowered the mask. The world turned green. I brought the flame to the locking mechanism of the door. "You're not getting in," I whispered to the steel. I began to melt the locking bars, fusing them to the frame. The metal glowed cherry red, then white hot, turning liquid and flowing into the gaps, sealing the door forever. The smell of hot metal overpowered the smell of blood. I worked for an hour, welding every seam, every bolt. When I was done, the door was not just locked. It was part of the wall. I turned off the torch. The hiss died away, leaving a ringing silence in my ears. I was safe. I was trapped. I walked over to the small porthole on the far side of the workshop, looking out toward the horizon. The sun was setting, painting the gulf in shades of bruised purple and orange. In the distance, toward the coast, I could see the faint glow of other platforms. One of them, the Deepwater Titan 10 miles to the north, was flaring. But it was not the controlled burn of a gas flare. The fire was on the deck, a massive, uncontrolled conflagration that was consuming the derrick. I watched as the structure groaned and crumpled, collapsing into the sea in a silent plume of steam and smoke. I looked at the radio on the workbench. It was still silent. I was alone on a floating island of steel, surrounded by miles of black ocean, with 100 monsters between me and the only way off. I picked up a wrench. "Check the generator," I said aloud. My voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "Check the water filtration. Inventory the food." I turned my back on the door and the dead thing pounding against it. There was work to be done. The adrenaline that had fueled my sprint to the workshop began to metabolize into a shaky, acidic nausea. I was alone in a 20 by 40-foot steel lung, suspended 50 feet above the Gulf of Mexico, sealed inside by my own hand and a pound of welding wire. The secondary engineering workshop was a space designed for violent mechanics. It was where we dragged the parts that were too heavy, too seized, or too broken to be fixed in the field. The floor was reinforced diamond plate, stained with years of hydraulic oil and moly grease. The walls were lined with heavy-duty Vidmar cabinets, each drawer capable of holding 400 pounds of steel. I sat with my back against the door I had just fused shut.
The steel was still radiating heat from the torchwork, a dull warmth pressing against my spine through my coveralls. Outside, the pounding had stopped, replaced by a silence that was far worse. The rig, the Peregrine, was a living organism. It vibrated. The massive diesel generators in the pontoon decks 4 levels down were still churning out megawatts of power, sending a subsonic tremor up through the structural columns and into the soles of my boots. But the human noise, the shouts, the clang of boots on grating, the radio chatter, was gone. I needed to stop shaking. Panic was a waste of calories. I pushed myself up. My knees popped, a sharp biological report in the quiet room. I walked to the center of the workshop and placed my hands on the heavy steel workbench. The metal was cool and scarred from 1,000 hammer blows. Priorities. The survival hierarchy was hardwired into me from years of offshore safety drills, but the context had shifted from await rescue to indefinite endurance. Air, water, power, defense. I looked up at the ceiling.
A network of galvanized ductwork ran the length of the room, fed by the central HVAC system located on the upper utility deck. That was a problem. The central system pulled air from the intake plenums, filtered it loosely for particulate matter, and pushed it through the entire accommodation block. If the virus, or whatever this pathogen was airborne, that duct was a direct injection line into my lungs. Even if it was not, the duct was 24 inches wide. A determined crawler could navigate it. I had seen the OIM's body distort and break. I knew the infected could force themselves through impossible geometries. I dragged a rolling ladder over to the far wall where the main supply vent entered the room. I climbed up, the casters squeaking on the oil-stained floor. I put my ear to the galvanized steel. I could hear the rush of air, a hollow, rushing wind sound. But underneath that, carrying through the metal like a tin can telephone, I heard wet, gurgling noises. Scuffing. Something was moving in the plenum. I descended the ladder, my movements deliberate. I went to the sheet metal rack in the corner. We kept sheets of 10-gauge steel there for patching hull plating. It was heavy, difficult to work with, and absolutely bulletproof. I pulled a 4-foot square sheet from the rack. It weighed nearly 40 pounds. I lugged it to the workbench and clamped it down. I needed a block-off plate. I grabbed a pair of pneumatic nibblers from the tool chest. I connected the air hose. The compressor in the corner chugged to life, a rhythmic, mechanical thumping that made me flinch. I waited for the pressure to build, watching the needle on the regulator climb past 90 psi. I marked the dimensions of the vent flange on the steel with a piece of soapstone. Then I triggered the nibblers. The tool screamed as it bit into the metal, chewing out a crescent moon-shaped curl of steel with every stroke. The vibration rattled my teeth. I focused entirely on the line. The soapstone mark was my world. If I cut this wrong, I would not get a seal. If I did not get a seal, I breathed what they were breathing. It took me 20 minutes to cut the plate and drill the bolt holes. My forearms were burning with lactic acid by the time I hauled the plate and a cordless impact driver back up the ladder. I did not bother unbolting the existing grill. I simply placed the heavy steel plate over it. I drove the first self-tapping screw into the duct flange. The impact driver rattled violently, torque twisting my wrist, before the screw bit into the metal with a high-pitched screech of friction. I drove it home until the washer deformed. I put in 20 more, one every 2 inches. When I was done, the rush of air from the vent was gone. The room was dead silent, save for the compressor's cycle. I had cut off the potential infection vector, but I had also cut off my fresh air supply.
I looked at the workshop volume. Maybe 8,000 cubic feet of air. With one occupant at rest, CO2 buildup would become a headache in 24 hours, lethal in a week. I would need to crack the heavy external door, the one leading to the open sea, not the walkway, to cycle air. But not yet. Not while the screams outside were still fresh. Next, water. I had a sink in the corner, fed by the rig's potable water loop. I turned the handle. A stream of clear water flowed out. I stared at it. It looked clean. It smelled of chlorine. But the desalination plant was automated. If the filters clogged, if the chemical injection pumps ran dry, or if biological matter got into the storage tanks, this water would kill me just as surely as the thing outside. I could not trust it. I shut the tap. I needed a distiller, a way to take any liquid, seawater, urine, contaminated coolant, and turn it into pure H2O. I began to prowl the workshop, my eyes scanning for shapes and materials. I was not seeing tools anymore. I was seeing components. In the hazardous materials locker, I found a clean, unused 5-gallon solvent drum made of stainless steel. That would be the boiler. For the condenser, I needed surface area and thermal conductivity. I walked to the scrap bin. There was a discarded hydraulic oil cooler from a crane winch.
It was a radiator. Basically, a loop of copper tubing with aluminum fins. It was covered in grime, but the core was intact. I brought the cooler to the parts washer. I donned heavy neoprene gloves and turned on the solvent pump. The brush bristled as I scrubbed the copper, stripping away layers of black grease until the metal shone like a new penny. I flushed it with degreaser, then with water, then with alcohol to strip the residue. Now, the connection. I found a length of 1/2-inch stainless steel tubing in the instrumentation drawer. It was swage lock tubing, high-grade stuff used for pressure gauges. I clamped it in the vise. I needed to bend it into a shepherd's hook to connect the boiler drum to the condenser coil. If I bent it too fast, the walls would collapse and kink. I grabbed a tubing bender, a specialized tool with a radius die. I slotted the tube in, lined up the 0 marks, and pulled the handle. The steel resisted. I felt the material yield curve through the handle, a stiff, plastic deformation. I pulled smoothly, keeping the pressure constant, until the tube formed a perfect 90-degree arc. Competence. The feeling of the metal obeying my hands was a drug. It pushed back the image of Miller's eyeless face. I drilled a hole in the lid of the solvent drum. I inserted the tubing and brazed it in place. Brazing stainless to stainless is tricky. You can't just heat it and dump solder. You need silver solder with a high silver content. And you need to control the heat to avoid carbide precipitation, making the steel brittle. I fired up the oxyacetylene torch again, dialing the flame down to a sharp, neutral cone. I applied the white paste flux to the joint. I brought the heat in, circling the tube, watching the steel change color. Straw, brown, blue, dull red. When the metal was the color of a cherry, I touched the silver rod to the joint. It did not drip. It flowed. Capillary action sucked the molten alloy into the gap between the tube and the lid, creating a silver ring that was stronger than the base metal. I stepped back, lifting the welding goggles. The joint was perfect. I set up the rig on the floor. The drum, boiler, sat on a heavy-duty electric strip heater I'd scavenged from a preheating oven. The tubing ran up and over, connecting to the cleaned hydraulic cooler, condenser, which I propped up at an angle so gravity would pull the condensate down. I needed a cooling medium for the condenser. Air cooling would not be efficient enough in this humidity. I looked at the fire suppression line running along the wall.
It was a 3-inch pipe, painted red, pressurized with raw seawater from the leg pumps. I grabbed a pipe wrench and a bucket. I cracked the drain valve on the fire line. The pressure was immense.
Water sprayed out with a violent hiss, hitting the bucket with enough force to splash back onto my face. It was warm, salty, and smelled of the ocean. I filled a plastic storage tub with the seawater and submerged the copper coil of my condenser in it. Now, the test. I filled the boiler drum with water from the sink, risky but fine for boiling, and sealed the lid. I clamped the strip heater around the base of the drum and plugged it into the 220-volt outlet on the workbench. The current hummed. I could feel the heat radiating from the element within seconds. I waited. 10 minutes. 15. The physics were absolute. At 212 degrees Fahrenheit, the water in the drum would phase change to steam. It would expand, rising up the tube, leaving the salts and contaminants behind. It would hit the copper coils submerged in the cool seawater bath. The thermal energy would transfer from the steam to the copper to the seawater, and the steam would collapse back into liquid water. Pure water. I sat on a stool, watching the end of the copper tube where it poked out of the cooling bath. I had placed a clean glass beaker underneath it. Nothing happened. Doubt began to creep in. Had I sealed the lid tight enough? Was the heater powerful enough? Then, a single drop formed at the lip of the tube. It hung there for a second, catching the light of the fluorescent strips. A perfect sphere of clarity. It fell. Plink. The sound was tiny, but to me, it sounded like a victory bell. Another drop. Then another. A steady, rhythmic cadence. I watched the beaker fill. An ounce. 2 ounces. I picked up the beaker. The glass was warm. I swirled the water. It was crystal clear. I took a sip. It tasted flat, metallic from the copper, and boiled. But it did not taste like salt. It did not taste like rot. I set the beaker down and let out a breath. I felt like I'd been holding for an hour. I had water. As long as the rig had power to run the heater, and as long as the sea did not dry up, I could drink. Power. That was the next variable. The lights overhead flickered, a quick dip in intensity that lasted a fraction of a second before stabilizing. The grid was unstable. The generators were running, but without the dynamic positioning operators in the control room to manage the load, the automated systems were hunting. If a thruster ramped up to fight a current and the generators did not respond fast enough, the whole bus could trip. Blackout. If the power died, my heater died. My lights died. The ventilation, if I opened the door, died. I needed an energy buffer. I went to the battery charging station. We had a dozen heavy-duty 18-volt lithium-ion batteries for the cordless grinders and drills. They were all plugged in. The LEDs on the chargers were solid green, fully charged. That was good for tools, but not for life support. I needed the deep cycle batteries. The workshop had an emergency lighting circuit powered by a bank of 4 12-volt AGM absorbent glass matte lead-acid batteries tucked under the main switchgear cabinet. I pulled the panel off. The batteries were dusty, connected in a series parallel configuration to provide 24 volts DC. I checked the voltmeter on the panel. 27.4 volts. They were floating on the charger. I needed to isolate them. If the main grid surged before it died, it could fry the rectifier and boil these batteries dry. I grabbed a pair of insulated wire cutters. I identified the main feed from the rig's bus. Thick, 4-gauge copper wire wrapped in black insulation.
I positioned the cutters. I hesitated. Once I cut this, I was on my own reserves. The lights flickered again, longer this time. The compressor stuttered. I squeezed the handles. The copper sheared with a dull snap. The resistance in the handles vanished as the metal parted. I quickly stripped the ends of the battery cables and connected them to a pure sine wave inverter I kept on the shelf for testing sensitive electronics. It was a 2,000-watt unit, yellow and black, heavy with heat sinks. I plugged the work light into the inverter. I flipped the switch. The inverter hummed, a high-pitched electronic whine that was barely audible. The work light blazed to life, casting a harsh, steady shadow across the floor. I had an island of power.
It was not much, maybe 200 amp hours, but it was mine. I could run the radio, I could charge a flashlight, I could run the small electric hot plate for a few hours if I had to. I sat back on the stool, surrounded by my creations. The still was dripping. The inverter was humming. The door was welded. I looked at the clock on the wall. 18 hours. My stomach cramped. I had not eaten since breakfast. I walked to the vending machine in the break area of the workshop. It was a glass-fronted monolith filled with processed sugar and sodium. I did not have a key. I did not have coins. I picked up a large, flathead screwdriver. I jammed it into the gap between the door and the frame near the latch. I leaned my weight into it. The sheet metal groaned and bent. The latch popped with a sharp metallic crack. The door swung open. I did not raid it wildly. I took a notepad. Inventory. 12 bags of honey-roasted peanuts, high protein, fat. 8 Snickers bars, sugar, peanuts. 15 bags of potato chips, empty calories, salt. 6 bottles of Gatorade. I did the math in my head. Roughly 15,000 calories. If I rationed to 1,500 a day, I had 10 days of food. 10 days. It felt like a lifetime. It felt like 10 minutes. I grabbed a bag of peanuts and a Gatorade. I sat on the floor, leaning against the leg of the workbench, and ate slowly, chewing every nut into a paste to extract maximum nutrition. I was safe. But safety is a relative term when you are trapped in a steel box. The sound started around 20 Huck. It was not the pounding on the door. It was coming from the ventilation duct I had sealed. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was the sound of fabric dragging on galvanized steel. It was slow, deliberate. I stood up, freezing, a half-eaten peanut in my hand. I looked up at the block-off plate I had bolted over the vent. Something bumped against it. Thump. A soft impact, like a head hitting the steel. Then a sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. It was not a scream. It was a sniff. A long, wet inhalation, right on the other side of the plate. The infected, Miller, the OIM, they had been frenzied, fast. This was different. This was curious. The sniffing stopped. Then a fingernail scratched against the steel plate. Scree. It was testing the barrier. I grabbed the impact driver. I scrambled up the ladder. I checked the screws. They were tight. The plate was 10-gauge steel. You could not scratch through it. You could not punch through it. But the psychological weight of that scratch was heavier than the metal. "Go away," I whispered, my face inches from the plate. The scratching stopped. Silence returned. But now I knew. They were not just outside the door.
They were in the arteries of the ship. They were crawling through the walls. I climbed down the ladder. I did not sleep. I spent the night fabricating.
I took lengths of angle iron and cut them into sharp 3-inch spikes. I welded them to the inside of the door frame. I welded them to the vent plate, facing outward, turning the workshop into a porcupine. I worked until my eyes burned and the battery on the inverter dropped to 70%. I worked because if I stopped, I would have to listen to the silence. And in the silence, I could hear the rig dying. Around 3:11, the main lights in the workshop died. The fluorescent tubes flickered once and went black. The hum of the compressor cut out. The rig's main generators had tripped. I was in total darkness, save for the single LED work light running off my inverter. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and deepen. The silence was absolute now. The vibration in the floor, the heartbeat of the Peregrine, was fading as the massive flywheels of the generators spun down. The rig was dead. I was a parasite living in a corpse. I walked to the portal. Outside, the world was black. The navigation lights were gone. The deck lights were gone. The only illumination came from the stars and the burning wreckage of the deep-water Titan on the horizon, a distant, flickering campfire in a watery hell. I checked my still. The strip heater was dead without the main power. The dripping had stopped. I had 3 liters of water. I had 10 days of food. I had 70% battery. And I had something scratching in the vents. I sat on the floor, the cold of the steel seeping into my legs. I gripped the pipe wrench in my lap until my knuckles turned white. Okay, I said to the dark room. Phase 1 complete. Phase 2 was going to be harder. Phase 2 meant I had to leave the box. The human vestibular system is a precision instrument. It knows down with absolute certainty. When you live on a floating rig, your inner ear calibrates to the slow, rhythmic heave of the ocean swell, a gentle, sinusoidal motion that becomes background noise. I woke up because the math changed. I was lying on the diamond plate floor of the workshop, wrapped in a fire-retardant blanket. The silence of the dead rig was heavy, pressing against my eardrums. But it was the angle of the floor that triggered my adrenal response. The workshop was tilting. Not the rolling pitch of a wave passing through, but a sustained, static list. I felt myself sliding imperceptibly toward the heavy steel cabinets along the starboard wall. I scrambled up, my boots finding traction on the grit of the floor. I grabbed a magnetic torpedo level from the workbench and slapped it against the vertical support beam. The bubble floated past the center lines, burying itself in the far right of the vial. 5 degrees. On land, a 5-degree tilt is an annoyance. On a semi-submersible drilling platform connected to the seabed by a rigid steel umbilical cord, it is a catastrophic precursor to structural failure. The Peregrine was a dynamic positioning rig. It did not use anchors to stay in place. It used GPS and massive computer-controlled thrusters to fight the wind and current, keeping the derrick perfectly aligned with the wellhead 5,000 feet below. But the power was gone. The thrusters were dead. The rig was a 100,000-ton cork drifting in the Gulf Stream. The problem was the riser, the 21-inch diameter steel pipe connecting us to the ocean floor. It was under tension. As the rig drifted off location, that pipe was being pulled taut, like a guitar string being stretched until it snapped. If the riser failed, 2 things would happen. First, the stored tension would release, whipping the pipe upwards with enough force to destroy the moon pool and potentially hull the pontoons. Second, and worse,
the wellhead would rupture. Without the mud weight to hold it back, the reservoir pressure would blow. Gas would rise. One spark, and the peregrine becomes a supernova. I needed to disconnect. I needed to fire the EDS, the emergency disconnect sequence. Usually this is done with a button press in the comfortable, air-conditioned drill shack. That was not an option. The backup was the BOP control unit, often called the Kumi unit, located in a reinforced room near the subsea engineering bay. It was outside my box. I looked at the welded door.
It would take me an hour to cut through it with the torch, and doing so would destroy my primary defense. I turned to the back of the workshop. There was a bolted maintenance hatch, 2 feet square, leading into the pontoon column void space. It was a labyrinth of structural bracing and ballast tanks that eventually led up to the machinery decks. I grabbed my tool bag. I added a heavy pipe wrench, a pry bar, and the flashlight. I checked the charge on the inverter. 60%. I plugged the flashlight in for 10 minutes while I prepped, giving it a final boost. I drank a precious cup of water from my beaker. My mouth was dry, tasting of copper and fear. "Do the job," I whispered. "Do not think about the monsters. Think about the hydraulics." I used the impact driver to back out the bolts on the maintenance hatch. They came out with high-pitched shrieks of dry metal on metal. I worked slowly, timing the noise with the groaning of the rig's structure as it shifted in the swell. I pulled the hatch free. A draft of cold, damp air hit my face. It smelled of stagnant seawater and rust. I crawled through. The void space was a cathedral of shadows. I was inside the support column, surrounded by massive diagonal cross bracing. The only light came from the beam of my flashlight, cutting a narrow cone through the darkness. The air was thick with the sound of water slapping against the hull plates from the outside, a hollow, booming resonance. I began to climb the service ladder. It went up 50 feet to the machinery deck level. My boots rang on the rungs. I tried to place them gently, rolling my weight from toe to heel, but in the acoustic chamber of the column, silence was impossible. I reached the top landing. A bulkhead door led to the HPU, hydraulic power unit room. I put my ear to the steel. Silence. No shuffling. No wet coughs. I turned the handle. It was stiff, unused for months. I put my shoulder into it and heaved. The door swung open, the hinges screaming a protest that sounded like a dying animal in the quiet rig. I froze, shining the light into the room. The HPU room was a maze of high-pressure piping, massive pumps, and banks of red accumulator bottles, tall, nitrogen-charged cylinders that stored the hydraulic energy needed to fire the blowout preventer, BOP, even when the power was dead. The room was empty of life, but it was full of danger. I moved to the main manifold. I needed to check the accumulator pressure. The gauges were analog, big faces with black needles. I wiped the dust off the glass of the main bank pressure gauge. 0 psi. My stomach dropped. The system had bled down. Without the electric charge pumps running, the hydraulic fluid had leaked back to the reservoir through checking valves that were never meant to hold pressure indefinitely. 0 pressure meant I could not fire the shear rams. I could not cut the pipe. The rig was tethered to the bottom, drifting further every second, pulling the nose of the platform down. I could feel the list increasing, gravity pulling me toward the forward bulkhead. I needed 3,000 psi to shear the pipe. I looked around the room. There was an emergency manual pump, a long lever arm connected to a piston. It was designed for testing, moving a few cubic inches of fluid at a time. To charge the main bank with that would take a week. I did not have a week. I had maybe an hour before the riser snapped.
I needed a pressure source. My eyes landed on the nitrogen quadrant. We kept a rack of backup nitrogen bottles, separate from the accumulators for purging lines. They were pressurized to 5,000 psi. If I could plumb the high-pressure nitrogen directly into the hydraulic pilot line, I could force the valve open. It was dangerous. Pneumatic pressure is spongy, explosive compared to hydraulic fluid. If a line burst, the expanding gas would act like a bomb. It was a violation of every engineering standard I knew. It was also my only shot. I ran to the nitrogen rack. I grabbed a quad, a cluster of 4 heavy cylinders. I dragged it across the grating. The steel screeching against the floor was deafening. I did not care. If the riser snapped, the noise would be a lot louder. I found a length of high-pressure hose with JIC fittings. I wrenched it onto the regulator of the nitrogen tank.
I scrambled over the manifold piping to the solenoid valves that controlled the blind shear rams. These were the massive blades on the seafloor designed to cut through the drill pipe and seal the well. I needed to bypass the electric solenoid and pump the gas directly into the actuator port. I unscrewed the hydraulic fitting on the valve block. Fluid dribbled out, viscous, red hydraulic oil. I threaded the nitrogen hose in. The threads were different, NPT versus JIC. Damn it, I hissed. I rummaged through my bag. No adapter. I looked at the connection. If I cross-threaded it, the steel might bite enough to hold for the few seconds I needed. If it blew out, the hose would whip around and take my head off. I forced the nut. I took the 36-inch pipe wrench and cranked it. The threads screamed as I destroyed them, mashing the steel together through sheer brute force. I turned it until the metal galling fused the 2 fittings together. Competence is knowing the rules. Survival is knowing which ones break without killing you. I stood back, gripping the valve of the nitrogen tank. I was about to open it when I heard the door behind me open. The sound was soft, the latch clicking, the hinges groaning. I turned the flashlight. Standing in the doorway was a man in blue coveralls, or the ruin of a man. His jaw was missing, torn away by some violence days ago, leaving a glistening red cavity of tongue and teeth. His chest was slick with oil and dried blood. He saw the light. He did not shield his eyes. He just stared, his head cocking to the side with that bird-like, twitchy movement. Then he let out a sound, a wet, gurgling hiss from the hole where his throat used to be. He charged. He did not stumble. He sprinted, his boots hammering the grating. I did not have a weapon in my hand. I had the nitrogen valve. I could not fight him and save the rig. I looked at the pressure gauge on the nitrogen tank. 4,500 psi. I looked at the infected man closing the distance. 20 feet. 10. I grabbed the loose end of a hydraulic hose lying on the bench, a heavy, steel-braided line with a heavy brass coupler on the end. The man leaped. I swung the hose. It was like swinging a mace. The brass coupler caught him in the temple with a sickening, solid impact that crunched like stepping on dry leaves. He went down, sliding across the oily grating. But he was not dead. He scrambled up immediately, one eye swelling shut, his hands reaching for me. I kicked him in the chest, driving him back into the pipe rack. He flailed, grabbing at the manifold, his fingers slipping on the greasy steel. I turned back to the nitrogen tank. I needed to fire the rams. "Die later!" I shouted at him. "Die later!" I ripped the valve open. The sound was incredible. A high-pitched scream of expanding gas rushing through the hose. The cross-threaded connection held for a microsecond, then hissed violently, but the pressure was moving. I watched the actuator pin on the shear ram valve. The gas hit it. The pin slammed over with a metallic clack that I felt through the floor. 5,000 feet below us, in the cold, crushing dark of the seabed, massive, hardened steel blades were driving closed. They were shearing through the thick steel of the drill pipe, crushing the riser, and sealing the wellbore. For a second, nothing happened on the surface. Then, physics caught up. The rig, which had been pulled down by the millions of pounds of tension in the riser, suddenly lost its anchor. The Peregrine leaped. It was a violent, upward lurch, like an elevator cable snapping. The floor dropped away, then slammed back up into my feet. The entire 100,000-ton structure sprang upwards, bobbing in the water as it found its new buoyancy equilibrium. I was thrown off my feet. I hit the grating hard, my shoulder taking the impact. The nitrogen hose blew. The cross-threaded connection failed under the shock. The hose whipped free, a flailing snake of high-pressure gas. It slashed through the air, striking the pipe rack, sparking against the steel. The infected man was trying to stand when the hose caught him. The heavy brass fitting, propelled by 4,000 psi of gas, struck him in the chest. It did not just break ribs, it caved in his thoracic cavity. He was thrown back against the bulkhead like a rag doll and slid down, motionless. The gas bottle emptied, the scream dying down to a hiss. The rig was rocking now, a slow, sickening roll as it drifted free. But the list was gone. The dangerous angle was correcting. We were adrift, but we were not going to capsize. I lay on the grating, gasping for air. The smell of raw nitrogen, metallic and cold, mixed with the copper scent of blood. I scrambled over to the infected man. I raised the pipe wrench, ready to finish it. He was not moving. The impact from the hose had shattered his sternum. His chest was still. I checked his coveralls. J. Evans, roustabout. I knew him. He had shown me pictures of his kids 2 weeks ago. I lowered the wrench. I did not hit him again. There was no point. I stood up, my legs shaking violently. The adrenaline crash was hitting me hard. I felt lightheaded, the edges of my vision graying out. I needed to get back to the box. The HPU room was not safe. The noise of the nitrogen release would draw every infected on the deck. I grabbed my bag. I grabbed a smaller, portable bottle of nitrogen just in case and strapped it to my back. I moved to the door. I peeked out. The corridor was empty, but I could hear them. Distant thuds, the sound of doors being tested. I slipped out, moving fast and low. I did not go back down the column ladder. It was too enclosed. I took the external walkway. The wind hit me. It was picking up, a precursor to the storm the heavy air had promised. The sky was a bruise of black and purple clouds. I reached the catwalk to the secondary workshop. There was one of them on the walkway, standing between me and my door. It was Sarah, the medic. She was leaning against the railing, looking out at the sea. Her uniform was torn. Her skin was gray, the veins black webbings across her face. She heard my boot scrape on the metal. She turned. Her eyes were gone, just like Miller's. But there was something in her posture, a hesitation. She took a step toward me. She opened her mouth. No words came out, just a dry, clicking sound from her throat. I raised the wrench. My hand was shaking. "Sarah," I whispered. "Do not." She lunged.
It was not a coordinated attack. It was a clumsy fall forward, arms grasping. I sidestepped. I pushed her. I did not strike her. I just shoved her with the flat of my hand against her shoulder. Her momentum carried her. She hit the railing. It was low, OSHA standard, but she was top-heavy. She tipped over. She did not scream as she fell. There was just the sound of wind, and then, a second later, a faint splash far below. I stood at the railing, staring down into the black water. I felt nothing. A terrible, cold numbness. I turned and ran to my door. I threw myself inside. I slammed the heavy steel door. I grabbed the welding torch. I relit it.
I welded the door shut again. I did not stop with the door. I welded a second bar across it, then a third. I sat on the floor, the torch sputtering out as I closed the valve. The rig rolled gently beneath me. We were drifting, heading north, maybe, or west, toward the shipping lanes, toward the shore, or out into the endless Atlantic. It did not matter. The riser was cut. The well was sealed. The immediate crisis was over. I looked at the water beaker. I took a sip. I pulled the notebook from my pocket. Under the inventory list, I wrote one line. Day 2. Disconnected. Then, below that, in smaller letters, sorry, Sarah. I crawled under the workbench, pulling the fire blanket over me. The workshop was cold now without the heat from the machinery. I closed my eyes, listening to the rig drift. The sounds were different now. No engine hum, no thruster vibration. Just the creak of steel and the slap of the waves. We were a ghost ship, and I was the only ghost still breathing. Time on a dead rig does not pass in hours or minutes. It passes in drops of water. My universe had contracted to the rhythmic accumulation of distillate in the glass beaker. The physics of survival were brutally linear. 1 pint of water required 3 hours of heat. 3 hours of heat required 6 ounces of scavenged hydraulic fluid burned in my improvised stove. 6 ounces of fluid required 20 minutes of hand-pumping the dregs from the reservoir of the hydraulic press in the corner. I had become a machine that converted hydrocarbons into hydration. It was day 14, or maybe day 15. I had stopped marking the wall after my grease pencil ran down to a nub. The distinction between Tuesday and Friday was irrelevant when the sun was just a gray variation of the darkness. I sat on the floor, wrapped in 3 layers of fire-retardant coveralls I had scavenged from the lockers. The air in the workshop was stagnant and cold, settling around 40 degrees Fahrenheit at night. Without the rig's massive engines generating waste heat, the steel hull had become a heat sink, sucking the warmth out of my body and radiating it into the infinite thermal mass of the ocean. I watched the flame. The stove was my masterpiece of desperation. When the batteries for the electric heater had finally died on day 4, plunging me into a darkness broken only by the dim gray light of the porthole, I had to adapt. I had taken a heavy steel ammo can, drilled air intake holes along the bottom, and fabricated a chimney from a length of 2-inch flexible exhaust hose I'd found in the generator parts bin. The fuel was Shell Tellus 46 hydraulic oil. It was viscous, amber fluid that was designed to resist burning, not encourage it. To make it combust, I had to create a wick system using strips of cotton rag soaked in the oil, fed by a gravity drip I'd rigged from a plastic coolant bottle. It burned with a dirty, orange flame that smelled of sulfur and hot asphalt. The soot was greasy, coating the inside of the workshop in a fine black film that stuck to my skin, my teeth, and the inside of my nose. But it boiled the water. I took a sip from the beaker. The water was warm and tasted faintly of smoke and copper. It was the best thing I had ever tasted. My stomach cramped, a sharp, twisting knot that had become my constant companion. I had finished the peanuts 3 days ago. The Snickers bars were a distant memory. I was down to the potato chips, crushed dust at the bottom of the bags, and a single bottle of Gatorade I was saving for a medical emergency. I looked at my hands. They were trembling, a fine, high-frequency vibration that made holding tools difficult. My fingernails were black with soot and grease. My skin was paper-thin, stretching tight over knuckles that seemed larger than they used to be. I was starving, but I was not dying. Not yet. I stood up. The head rush hit me like a physical blow, tunneling my vision. I grabbed the workbench to steady myself, feeling the cold steel bite into my palm. "Work," I rasped. My voice was a croak, unused and dry. "Focus on the work." The rig was drifting. I could feel it in the soles of my boots. A long, slow heave that was different from the anchored motion. We were riding the loop current now, that massive river of warm water that flows up from the Caribbean and pushes into the Gulf. I needed to know where we were. I shuffled to the porthole. I had modified it on day 7. Using the impact driver and every ounce of leverage I could muster, I had removed the heavy retention ring of the glass. I could not remove the glass itself, it was too dangerous to leave an opening, but I had loosened the seal enough to run my exhaust hose out the side, packing the gap with high-temperature gasket material to keep the sea spray out. I pressed my face to the thick glass. The ocean was a slate-gray expanse of whitecaps. The sky was low and oppressive. But there, on the horizon to the west, was a shape. It was not a ship. It was too static, too dark. It was land. It was just a smudge, a hardening of the horizon line, but it was there, maybe 50 miles away. If we were drifting west, we were heading toward Texas or Mexico. If we hit a shoal, the rig would ground. If we hit deep water, we would drift forever. I turned back to the room. The silence was heavy. The scratching in the vents had stopped days ago. The infected were biological entities. They obeyed the laws of thermodynamics. Without food, without warmth, they were powering down. I assumed they were either dead or in some kind of cryptobiotic state, waiting for a stimulus. I walked to the door. The welds were holding. The steel was cold and solid. I put my ear against it. Nothing. Not even the wind. Just the deep, structural groan of the rig as it flexed in the swell. I had a sudden, terrifying urge to open it, to cut the welds, to just see. The isolation was becoming a physical weight, pressing on the back of my skull. I found myself having conversations with the torque wrench. I explained the principles of leverage to it. I confessed my sins to the drill press. "Sarah," I whispered to the empty room. Did I close the valve fast enough? The room did not answer. I needed a task. Competence was the tether keeping me from drifting away like the rig. I decided to clean the injectors. There were no injectors to clean. I had no engine, but there was a box of spare fuel injectors for the crane diesel in the parts cabinet. I took them out. I laid a clean rag on the bench. I disassembled the first injector. It was a precision instrument, a needle valve machined to tolerances of 10,000ths of an inch. I cleaned the nozzle with solvent.
I polished the needle with fine grit emery cloth until it shone like a jewel. I reassembled it, feeling the spring tension, the click of the retaining clip. Then I took it apart and did it again. It was a meditation of steel. It kept my hands busy. It kept the hunger at bay.
Day 22 brought the storm. It started with a drop in pressure that made my ears pop. The gray light in the porthole turned a bruised, sickly green. The swell increased, the floor tilting 5 degrees, then 10, then 15. The Peregrine was top-heavy. Without the ballast pumps to trim the load, we were at the mercy of the physics of buoyancy. I secured the workshop. I lashed the rolling tool chests to the structural beams with ratchet straps. I took my water still apart and packed the glass components in bubble wrap inside a drawer. I extinguished the oil stove. A fire during a list would be fatal. Then the wind hit. It slammed into the rig with a force that vibrated the entire 100,000-ton structure. The sound was a continuous, low-frequency roar that drowned out my own thoughts. I wedged myself into the corner between the heavy cabinets and the wall, wrapping my arms around my knees. The rig pitched violently. Tools I had not secured, a screwdriver, a roll of tape, slid across the floor, hitting the far wall with sharp, staccato impacts. Rain lashed against the porthole. It was not falling down. It was flying sideways, a horizontal sheet of water that hammered the glass. Water. Fresh water. I looked at the porthole. The gasket I had jury-rigged for the exhaust hose was leaking. A trickle of water was running down the steel wall, pooling on the floor. I scrambled up, fighting the motion of the deck. I grabbed a plastic bucket. I pressed it against the wall, catching the trickle. I tasted it. It was salty, mixed with spray, but fresh enough to drink if I boiled it. But I needed more. I looked at the exhaust hose. It ran out through the gap in the window seal. If I pulled the hose in, I would have a 1-inch gap open to the storm. It was a risk. The wind pressure could blow the heavy glass pane inward if I disturbed the seal too much. I grabbed the pry bar. I wedged myself against the wall, bracing my feet. I pulled the hose. It resisted, stuck in the sealant. I yanked it. The hose popped free. Instantly, a jet of water and air screamed into the room. It was like a pressure washer nozzle. The wind howled through the gap, a high-pitched shriek that pierced my eardrums. I shoved the end of the hose, which was now acting as a funnel from the outside, into a 5-gallon bucket. The bucket filled in seconds. The water was brown, mixed with rust from the exterior plating and soot from the hose, but it was water. Gallons of it. I filled the first bucket, then the second, then the solvent drum. I was laughing. A dry, hacking sound that was lost in the wind. I was soaked to the bone, shivering violently, the cold rain mixing with the sweat and grime on my skin. "Take that," I shouted at the storm. "You can't kill me. I'm an engineer." I filled every container I had, 50 gallons, 100. When I ran out of buckets, I jammed a wooden plug I'd whittled earlier into the gap, hammering it home with a mallet until the shrieking wind was cut off. I collapsed on the wet floor, surrounded by my sloshing treasure. I had enough water to last 6 months. I drank from the bucket, cupping the brown water in my hands. It tasted of iron and victory. The storm passed, leaving the rig battered but afloat. Day 30. The hunger was no longer a cramp. It was a hollowness. I moved slowly, conserving every calorie. My mind was sharp, crystalline, but my body was failing. I spent hours staring at the portal, watching the sea. The rig had stopped drifting. It was not a sudden stop.
It was a gradual cessation of the heave and pitch. The background vibration of the waves changed from a deep resonance to a sharper, slapping sound. We had grounded. I went to the porthole. We were close. The dark shape on the horizon was now a wall of green mangroves and gray sand less than a mile away. The rig had drifted onto a sandbar or a reef, listing hard to port, stuck fast. I could see birds, gulls wheeling in the sky. I could see a beach, and beyond it, the ruin of a coastal town. Roofless houses, a collapsed water tower, cars rusted in the streets. I stood there for a long time. I had a choice. I could cut the welds on the door. I could fight my way through the dark interior of the rig, past whatever dormant horrors still lurked in the corridors.
I could launch a lifeboat, if the davit still worked, and if the cables had not seized. I could row to that shore. And then what? I looked at the town. No smoke, no movement, just the stillness of the grave. If I went there, I would be a scavenger. I would be exposed. I would be hunting for cans of beans in a world full of things hunting me. Here, in the workshop, I was the master of my environment. I had water. I had tools. I had steel walls. But I had no food. I looked at the inventory list. Chips, 0. Peanuts, 0. Gatorade, 0. I was starving to death in a fortress. I turned to the corner of the workshop. There was a fishing kit in the survival locker I had not touched. A spool of heavy monofilament line. Hooks. I looked at the porthole. We were in shallow water now, maybe 40 feet deep. I picked up the impact driver. I spent the afternoon modifying the porthole again. I removed the wooden plug. I fabricated a bracket that extended 2 feet out from the hull, carrying a pulley. I baited the hook with a piece of red rag soaked in hydraulic oil. Fish are attracted to shiny things and strange smells. I lowered the line. I waited. The sun went down. The moon rose, illuminating the water. The line jerked. It was not a subtle nibble. It was a violent tug that pulled the line taut against my finger, slicing the skin. I hauled it in, hand over hand. The weight was substantial. A fish broke the surface. A red snapper, maybe 5 pounds. It flopped on the workshop floor, its scales glittering in the light of my oil lamp. I stared at it. It was life. It was protein. I killed it quickly with a hammer blow. I cleaned it on the workbench, using a razor-sharp chisel as a fillet knife. I saved the guts for bait. I cooked it on the oil stove. The smell of roasting fish filled the workshop, overpowering the scent of hydraulic fluid and old sweat. I ate it with my fingers, burning them on the hot flesh. It was the best meal of my life. Day 45. Routine is the armor of the mind. 6:11. Wake up. Check the fishing lines. I had 3 now. 7:11. Clean and fillet the catch. 8:11. Distill water. For purity, the rainwater was getting stagnant. 12:11. Maintenance. I had started expanding. I realized that the infected inside the rig were likely trapped in specific zones. The fire doors and bulkheads would have contained them. I needed more space. I needed fuel for the stove. I carefully cut a small inspection port in the welded door using the torch, a 4-inch circle. I peered out into the corridor. It was empty. Dust motes danced in the beam of my flashlight. I saw a body further down the hall, desiccated, still. I welded a heavy steel pipe to the hole, creating a secure airlock for passing items through, but I did not open the door.
Not yet. Instead, I turned my attention to the ventilation system.
I had blocked it, but now I unbolted the plate. I built a cage trap inside the ductwork, facing outward. If anything crawled in, it would trigger a spring-loaded steel plate that would decapitate it. Nothing came. The rig was silent. I began to realize the truth. The Peregrine was not a prison. It was a castle, and I was its king. I spent my evenings sitting by the porthole, watching the sun set over the dead coast. I cleaned my tools. I sharpened my chisels. I organized the screws by thread pitch and length. I was thinner now, gaunt. My beard was a thicket of black wire. But my hands were steady. My eyes were clear. I picked up the radio. It had been silent for weeks, the battery long dead. I had rigged a crude charging system using a hand-crank generator from a flashlight, splicing the wires into the radio's battery pack. I cranked it for an hour every night. I turned the volume up. Static. The eternal white noise of a dead world. "This is Elias Thorne," I said into the mic. My voice was calm, authoritative. "Reporting from the Peregrine. Location, grounded. Approximate coordinates 26 north, 97 west. Status, secure." I did not ask for rescue. I did not plead for help. I have water. I have food. I have power. I paused, listening to the static. If anyone is listening, stay off the frequencies. Save your batteries. Survive. I released the button. I stood up and walked to the wall where I had drawn a schematic of the rig in charcoal. I had plans. I could cut through the deck to the battery room. I could salvage the solar panels from the lifeboats. I could rig a wind turbine using the fan blades from the HVAC units. There was so much work to do. I looked at the wrench in my hand. It was an extension of my body. A tool for fixing a broken world, one bolt at a time. I was not waiting for the end anymore. The end had come and gone. I was just getting started.